Welcome to this webinar on focus groups. I'm Karina Schofield.
And I'm Grace Brown, and we're both researchers at Holt International Business School. We will spend around 20 minutes to half an hour talking you through the key things that you need to think about and prepare for when conducting a focus group. Starting with an explanation of what a focus group usually looks like and when and why you might use one. Then we will talk through some guidelines of how you can run a focus group, thinking about how you could recruit participants, what you might need to prepare for the session, and some guidelines to help you facilitate the group successfully. Then we'll show you some examples of analysis and reporting. We will also provide some tips from our experience of focus groups throughout and have included some handy references at the end. So what is a focus group? It's a qualitative research method used often in social research, which is our main focus, but they're also used a lot in market research. Essentially, they are group conversations which are guided by a researcher or facilitator who has a focus on a defined topic area and asks relevant questions to this topic. The conversations are usually voice recorded with participants' permission, and the goal is to understand the why behind certain opinions or behaviours and to capture the way that participants react to each other's perspectives. In terms of numbers of participants, some sources say 7 to 10, others say 6 to 8, but we've both run successful focus groups with anywhere between 4 to 15 participants. It's always a good idea to invite around 12 or 15 to account for people dropping out. Focus groups don't always need to be face-to-face. We often run virtual focus groups as well when participants can't get together in the same place, and we use video conferencing to do this.
So when might you want to run a focus group? Well, a focus group provides an opportunity to explore people's thoughts and feelings, their behaviour, opinions and attitudes, and also any relevant experiences. It's a useful method for obtaining several perspectives about the same topic. By bringing people together to discuss a topic, you can provoke an exchange of views and provide information and insights less likely to surface during a one-to-one interview. Focus groups can be used at different stages in the research process. They can be used as a starting point for research into a specific area, so to explore and generate hypotheses and develop questions or concepts for surveys or interview guides. They can also be used as an aid to exposing and clarifying concepts after data has already begun. For example, to delve into statistical findings from a survey in more detail. And as with any research method, there are advantages and disadvantages to running focus groups. So what are the advantages of conducting focus groups? Some of the key strengths are summarised on the table shown here, starting with insights and detailed information. Given their qualitative nature, focus groups allow researchers to look beyond the facts and numbers that might be obtained via other methods. Researchers can learn or confirm the meaning behind the facts. In this way, they are useful to gain a real insight and obtain detailed information about personal and group feelings, perceptions and opinions. Secondly, focus groups can save time and money compared to individual interviews. Interviewing large groups of people at once is more cost-effective than interviewing people individually. Next, individuals are more likely to provide candid responses. People are often more comfortable in voicing views in each other's companies than on their own with the researcher. Through facilitated discussion, participants can build on each other's ideas through piggybacking. Participants are also given a chance to reflect or react to the viewpoint of others with which they may disagree or of which they are unaware. Focus groups also provide the researcher with an opportunity to seek clarification. In particular, the researcher can clarify clashes among participants and ask about these diverse opinions. And as described previously, they can also be used to clarify any findings obtained from earlier research, such as a survey. And finally, focus groups can provide useful materials, for example, quotes for publications and presentations. At the same time, the focus group methodology has its limitations, and some of the key ones are listed in the table shown here, starting with being hard to control. The focus group relies heavily on assisted discussion to produce results, and as such, the facilitation of discussions is critical. This means that the quality of the discussion depends on the skills of the moderator, And as you can imagine, controlling the discussion and managing the process is much more difficult than when conducting an individual interview. Secondly, it can be difficult to get people to participate, and even if people do want to take part, it can be difficult to get the same people in the same place at the same time, although virtual groups may be able to help with this. Another limitation may be due to dominant participants and groupthink. Some participants may find a focus group situation intimidating or off-putting. The group could be made up of a few individuals who are quieter, whilst others may dominate the discussion, and their contribution can be disproportionate as they take control of the debate and may impact the end result, or possibly even introduce bias as participants may feel under pressure to agree with their dominant view. Although collecting the data may be quicker, focus group discussions provide large volumes of qualitative data, and so the analysis of this could be time-consuming and challenging. And finally, focus groups are not suitable for all topics. They shouldn't be used in situations where participants may be disclosing potentially sensitive information or opinions about their workplace or colleagues. It's always best practice to collect data using a one-to-one interview format rather than a focus group. This reduces the risk to the participant and increases the likelihood of accessing accurate data. We will now move on to how to run a focus group. There are a number of things to consider when thinking about running focus groups, and this diagram shows some of the key areas. So reading from left to right, what is the purpose of the focus group? What do you want to find out? Who will you talk to and what are you going to ask? Who will facilitate the discussions and what do they need to do? And finally, how will the discussions be analysed and reported? And we'll cover each of these sections in turn now. So starting with the purpose and aims of the focus groups. The first thing you need to think about is what you want to find out. So at this stage you need to think about the overall aims of your research and document these as core objectives for the focus groups to explore. An example shown here from a recent research project we conducted about millennials in the workplace. Once the purpose of the group or groups is clear, then everything else follows on from that. The next area you need to consider is who you will want to talk to and how you're going to recruit them.
First, you need to decide who you want to talk to. The decision about who you want to talk to is likely to be clear from the purpose. For example, if your research question looks at the impact of an intervention, you'll want to speak to people who have been through that intervention. Or if you want to find out what barriers older workers face in the workplace, you'll want to speak to older workers. In other cases, the decision of who to talk to might be less obvious. For example, a project that Karina and I are working on currently asks what educators need to do differently as a result of developments in artificial intelligence. Rather than speaking to the educators themselves or to AI developers, we chose to speak to students who are currently going through education to ask them what they feel they need to know to prepare them for a career increasingly shared with AI. Depending on the purpose of the research, you need to ask yourself, who can give me the most insight into this problem or research question that I'm trying to solve? Secondly, you need to think about the sort of conversation you want to have. Do you want a variety of different views? And if so, you need to recruit people from different roles, areas or functions. Or do you want people to have had common experiences which they can talk about together so that you can dig deeper into these specific areas? If you want to do this, you'll need to invite people from similar roles, backgrounds or areas. And it's a toss-up between depth or breadth as to whether you want a diverse or homogeneous group of people in the room. In terms of how many participants, as I mentioned before, you can run a focus group with anything from 4 to 15 participants, and it's always worth inviting a few more to account for those who drop out. In terms of recruiting these participants, sometimes you might have contact details of people that you'd like to speak with. Often though, you need to approach the gatekeeper of the group that you want to sample from. So say you want to interview a team of people from within an organisation about staff training. In that instance, you may want to speak to a manager in the L&D department. It's useful to gain participants' contact information from the gatekeeper prior to the focus group. This means you'll be able to introduce yourself or provide an information sheet and then ask for their voluntary participation and informed consent as well. And it's a good idea for researchers to do this rather than relying on the gatekeeper to do it for them, because this ensures that when the data collection begins, participants are aware of the research and their optional involvement. This prior contact also enables the researcher to build rapport so that you're not going in cold and the focus group isn't the first time that you've introduced yourself to everyone. Sometimes you might need to offer incentives to encourage voluntary participation. We often tell people that in return for their participation, we'll give them an advance copy of the report as an informal incentive. Or if you have funding, you might want to offer something else. So we've used Amazon vouchers in the past. And then how many groups you actually want to run. So the number of groups in the project obviously determines how much data the research produces, and there are a number of things that might influence the number of groups that you need. The key thing though is to do enough groups so that you can see similar things and opinions arising to the extent that you can anticipate what might come up in future groups. So when you begin to see the same things again and again, you have reached saturation and can be fairly sure that you have enough data. There are some other things that will determine how many groups it will take to reach saturation. If you've got high diversity within each group, for example, you'll usually need to run more groups because the diversity in the group often makes it more difficult to identify coherent themes or common opinions and experiences. Another factor that affects the number of groups is the degree of structure in the focus groups. So in general, if you have very unstructured groups, conversations are likely to go off in different directions, and this will increase the variability from group to group, meaning that you'll have to run more groups to be able to see clear commonalities. And the number of groups will also be determined by the practical availability of participants as well. Ethics and consent. There are a couple of things that you'll need to do to make sure you are conducting your research ethically, and you need to ensure that the gatekeepers providing access to participants, as well as the participants themselves, are aware of the following things that are on the slide. So they need to be aware of the purpose of your research and what you aim to do, and the types of data that will be collected as well. So you need to let them know what kinds of data they will be asked to provide, for example, experiences, opinions or reactions. They need to know how data will be recorded and aware of any recording devices or observers. And they need to know how their data will be used. So describe any outputs that the data will be used to inform, for example, research reports or papers. In situations where participants are all employees of an organisation, unless contracted otherwise, researchers do not have a responsibility to feed back to the organisation, and this fact must be clearly communicated to the organisation and to the participants before and during initial contact. So you need to clarify that their data that will not be used in any other way than for research purposes. You also need to ensure that participants know how their data will be kept confidential and how their identities will remain anonymous. And also tell participants if any other researchers will have access to the data. And especially in the case of focus groups, it's also important to tell participants to respect the confidentiality of any data that others disclose during the group. And you also need to make sure that everyone is aware that they are free to withdraw themselves from the study at any time, and this won't have any negative consequences. I always find that you need to be very clear and confident when you're telling participants of these guidelines, and the clearer and confident that you can be on these, the more open participants are with sharing their perspectives. I always ask them if they have any questions about the ethical principles before you start, and this helps to clear up any concerns before you begin the discussion, and then remind them again of confidentiality and anonymity again at the end of the group.
The next stage is to think about what you're going to ask the people in your focus group and how you're going to ask it. In this stage, you should create a document that is known as a discussion guide or a topic guide. You should have already documented your aims and objectives, so this is a great starting point for the discussion guide. Including these at the top of the guide is helpful for anyone who facilitates the group. Following this, you should include all of the key sections to cover with approximate timings to make sure you know how long to spend in each section. The sections will vary on what you're asking and who you're talking to, but there are always some things that should always be included. Firstly, you should start by spending around 5 minutes on introductions. During the introductions, researchers and facilitators should welcome the participants, thank them for coming, introduce themselves, and if relevant, their organisation. The research aims should be introduced and participants should be told how long the discussions will take. It's important to put all participants at ease by explaining that there are no right or wrong answers. You just want to hear their points of view and their examples and stories. During this stage, you may want to state some ground rules. For example, explaining that not everyone has to agree with each other, but they must listen respectfully as others share their views. You should also ask permission to record the discussions and provide participants with details of how the recordings will be used. It's then time for the participant introductions. You can ask them to state their first name and then any other relevant information, for example, their job role or how long they've been with the organisation, and so on. You may want to ask them a general question to act as an icebreaker. This means that everyone has had a chance to speak up front and everyone's voice is recorded along with their name. Following this, it's useful to think in terms of topic areas to start with, rather than particular questions, as you are aiming for people to discuss issues rather than just answer a question. So think more conversational than questionnaire, and I'll move on to this in a minute. And then the final section should include a couple of questions, such as, what are the most important issues have we discussed today? Have we missed any important topics you would like to discuss? And then the conclusion section will also involve thanking participants, confirming what happens next and reassuring them over confidentiality, and also letting them know about how they can find out about any outputs from the research or how they can find out more information or get in touch if they have any questions. Here is an example of the start of a topic guide for a research project we've been working on recently. As described before, it documents the core objectives for the focus group, which is useful for whoever is going to run the group. It then goes on to detail each of the key sections with its aim and approximate timings. And this is the end of the discussion guide with the concluding questions I mentioned and concluding remarks. Moving on to the topics and questions to be covered. Don't worry too much at this stage about the individual question wording, it's the aim behind the question that's important. Then once you know the key topic areas you want to cover during the discussions, you can think of some more questions. You should start with some more general questions and then move on to more specific issues. And when thinking about questions, you should avoid closed questions, which can result in a yes or no answer, and instead use open-ended questions. So instead of asking, do you like X? Instead ask, what do you think about X? Or how do you feel about X? You can also use prompts such as tell me more, or explain what you mean. Can you provide an example of that, to get people to expand on any of their answers? And you can open up the discussions to the group by asking, do others in the group agree, or what do others think about that? In this way, participants may build upon each other's comments. It's also worth remembering to pause and give people a chance to think about their responses before immediately trying to fill any silences. Try to use questions that get participants involved, so ask them to reflect on their own experiences or to provide examples and stories that they have. And then you can end the discussions with a couple of summary questions as described previously.
Moving on to the actual facilitation of the group. There are some practical things. So in the case of focus groups, ideally you would have 2 researchers present, and this can enrich the discussion questions posed, and it can also allow one researcher to lead and the other to observe, resulting in more comprehensive data. It also ensures that the lead researcher is supported if a difficult situation arises. And the room should be set up in a communal circle so that everyone can see each other and talk to each other. And during the group, a clear and confident approach from the outset will set the tone for a mutually respectful exchange. Something that's happened to me before is the fact that people are asked to give their names at the beginning of the group sometimes causes confusion on the anonymity point. So we emphasise that we only need participants' names for the purpose of the group, and when the data is transcribed, it is anonymised. We also sometimes draw a picture of the table at the beginning of the group also to document who's in the room, how many people, whether they're male or female, and if you can get their roles and names onto that as well, which helps when it comes to writing up your notes at the end of the group. During the focus group, the researcher has two key roles. The first is to guide the discussion to fulfil the research aims. So introducing the research and informing participants of its purpose will help with this. And then the use of the topic guide will help to direct the discussion over areas of particular importance. The second role is to ensure that all of the participants make a contribution by creating an open atmosphere and making people feel relaxed, and by showing an interest in what they say, and also preventing more vocal participants from dominating the discussion and gently drawing out quieter participants. The idea is to get participants speaking to each other and having a discussion and voicing their opinions on the topic of interest and reacting to what other participants are saying, perhaps exchanging anecdotes and commenting on others' experiences. In some cases, participants will start asking questions to other members of the group, and provided this is on topic, this is a really good sign. So the aim is to facilitate a group dialogue rather than asking participants questions one by one. During the group as well, it's a good idea to take notes. So if somebody says something really good or you catch a really good quote, you can reflect that back to get more detail, and also as you go along make some notes of the headline topics or key comments. Some tips when facilitating focus groups include considering whether the research topic requires the use of researchers with particular experience so they know which questions to ask. And also bear in mind an awareness of context. Business school research often involves visiting organisations in order to collect data from employees. It's useful to gain an awareness of the organisational culture, dynamics and cultural norms before entering an organisation. And if data is being collected overseas, it's also best practice to be aware of the cultural norms and expectations of that context. If researchers are collecting data from a specific team or cohort within an organisation, it's also a good idea to be aware of any hierarchies or events or issues which have occurred recently within that team. At the end of the session, it's always good to try and end on a positive note. Once you've finished running all the focus groups, you move into the analysis and presentation stage. A useful starting point for the analysis is a good idea once the session has ended to debrief together as researchers, or if you're on your own, to write down some notes immediately after when the session is still fresh in your mind. So the following questions are useful ways to take notes. So you might want to note down how the group went. Were there many talkative participants? Was everyone in agreement or disagreement? What were the overall feelings of the group in this area? Were they positive, negative, or a mixture? What were the key topics or issues, or most important issues that were discussed? And are there any other details? As well as making a note of the details of the group demographics for future reference. For example, what functions they were from, what area of the business did they work in, what grade were they? All these details are useful to come back to when it comes to analysis and write-up. You'll want to get your focus groups transcribed, and we have a number of approved suppliers that we can use to get in contact with if you need pointing in the right direction. And analysis-wise, the type of analysis you do will be guided by your overall epistemology. If you're planning to write an academic qualitative paper, you will need to be clear about your epistemological approach and how this informed your analysis. And there's some more details about this on the hyperlink on the slide there. And some of the common ways to analyse focus group data include a thematic analysis, if you want to get an idea of the salient key themes and sub-themes related to the research area. This mainly focuses on the explicit content of what is said, and there are a number of ways that you can do thematic analysis, and there's some references about this at the end. One of these is a thematic analysis a thematic network analysis, which you can see an example of on the slide on the left there. Conversation analysis can also be used if you want to look deeper into the group interaction and the style of dialogue and how people relate to each other within that group. This includes a focus on tacit as well as the explicit nature of the data. If you want to do a conversation analysis, it's important to do the interviews face to face and get the recordings transcribed verbatim, and use a video recorder with participants' permission so that you can include non-verbal as well as verbal communication. There's a book by Robin Woofit that's included in the reference list for more information on this. Content analysis can also be used to analyse focus group data, and this is essentially a way of turning qualitative data into a quantitative form, usually using word or topic frequency counts to determine trends in data or a significance of concepts or shifts in opinion over time. Bear in mind this needs the use of analysis software. And on the slide there are some examples of how you can present your findings. In the middle is a snippet from our Voice of the Baby Boomers report, and that shows how we use quotes in the light blue to illustrate the points made in the main text. And the top right is a model which shows key themes from a thematic analysis that I did on a diversity and inclusion project. To recap, focus groups are group conversations facilitated by a researcher who is guiding the discussion over particular topics of interest to the research question. They're best used when you want to get an insight into why people feel, think or behave in a certain way. And there are a number of things that you can do to prepare for your focus group to ensure it is a success, namely creating a topic guide, building rapport with participants in advance, adhering to ethical guidelines and making yourself aware of the context that participants are coming from. We have given you our tips to make facilitation smooth and productive by creating a relaxed and safe space and asking open questions. Finally, we've briefly mentioned a few methods of analysis that are commonly used to unpack focus group data, and some more info on these are in the references. Hopefully this has been helpful, and feel free to contact either of us using the email addresses on the slide. Thank you for listening.